This is going to be a truly interactive exercise where we are going to examine, in turn, 5 questions relating to the role of the media and democracy. We're going to discuss those questions, we're going to debate those questions, and we're going to vote on those questions. How we view those questions both here in our audience in this studio as well as around the world. We're going to be joined in this discussion both through a recorded message from Professor Dugmore. Also, we're joined via satellite. We're going to be connecting to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and we have some of our panelists here in front of us. Let me now introduce those who will be taking us through this exercise. First of all, we're going to hear comments and the questions themselves from Professor Harry Dugmore.
So let me pose the first question. Does the ease of getting your message out and getting your voice out that new media provides, does that dilute the power of the ownership and control of the so-called mainstream media?
And I'm going to use my discretion as the moderator and go to Kuala Lumpur and ask Prem, who has had some direct experience. How do you vote on this question, Prem? And could you tell us why, based on your experience?
If I look at young people in Malaysia, really their use of Facebook, of social media to express themselves makes them take freedom of expression for granted. So therefore, I think that there's a twofold change that we will see, a short-term change whereby governments find it increasingly more difficult to control media, and although they try to stop it, there will be this gradual change. And at the same time, a long-term a demographic change whereby younger people actually accept freedom of expression as part and parcel. And as these younger people filter through the regime, and regimes try to bring in reformers and incorporate people who the best people, the best talents in the field, as these people rise up to leadership positions, you will see a gradual change in these regimes. So I think give it another. I think you will see some early gains in more free elections. In another 10 years, you will see more long-term changes. I hope that helps.
It does, Prem. Thank you very much. And for those of you at home, we're eager for your votes. And those of you who are here in the studio, eager for your votes. And it's quite simple. You simply text in your choice. As a text message, you start with the message PF. And if your answer is yes, it is PFA. If it is no, it is PFB. And then you send your message to the number on the screen, 316-4250-0346. And if you want to offer a comment at your computer outside of our studio, you can do so on Twitter, and you've just followed the instructions on your screen. And if you're here in the audience, we're going to ask you to make your comment here. But before we do, let me turn to the other members of our panel.
I might say yes. Just look at the situation in Burma. Of course, the space for new media is very tiny, very small. But when you look at mainstream media is totally controlled by the government. There are some privately run journals and magazines, but they are subject to censorship. So the whole thing is controlled by the government. So in the country, mainstream media means propaganda, one-sided.
Okay, let's move on to question number 2, and we'll send it back to Professor Dugmore.
The second topic of discussion that I think is really interesting is, does new media allow for much freer elections because there are more eyes and ears on the ground? There's simply more people with cell phones in their pocket and access to websites and YouTube that people can see what's happening, and it's much harder to rig elections and to cheat elections in various ways. So the question really is for us to vote on. Does this proliferation of voices make it harder to rig elections, or do repressive governments just find ways around it anyway? And it'd be interesting to see what you think about that.
Will new media provide for more eyes and ears on the ground, leading to fairer and more credible elections? If you say yes, it will make election fraud much more difficult. You will vote A. No, repressive regimes will always be able to find ways to stop that regardless of the existence of new media. A or B, that's the choice. Other comments, either from our panel or from here in the audience or from those at home, and we're working on that Twitter connection. We hope you will use it using the information on your screen. And also, if you would text your vote on this question. Unfortunately, you have A or B, not A.1 or somewhere in the middle, but we're getting much more of a difference of opinion expressed so far on our voting tabulation. 38% claiming yes, it will make things make fraud more difficult. 62% no, regimes are going to find ways to stop it anyway. So I think that the voting is reflecting the views that are expressed, have been expressed so far.
So the question for us to vote on is, does new media help shift people away from affiliation voting based on culture or ethnicity or language and towards the issues? Or in fact, as some others have argued, does it in fact increase our tendency to clump together around, for example, ethnicity?
How does the new media affect this kind of voting? If you're, again, at home or in your office and you'd like to cast your vote, please do by texting your answer in using the information on the screen. And if you have a comment, please Twitter, and we'll try to get to those comments. William.
Okay. I think two things. It depends on the level of civil society activism, and that's, if we're talking about issues here, we're saying, I mean, the implication of the question is that coverage of issues is better than just voting on affiliation-based voting. Some parties may actively go on that basis. They may actively be, for example, quite xenophobic, and they're saying, we don't want these people from other countries because they smell funny and they're evil. They might be fundamentally racist in their outlook. And they would encourage that kind of thing, and they can make very effective use, and they do make effective use of new media to mobilize people around that. So it can, in that level, help encourage affiliation-based voting that can be very narrow and extremely offensive. At the same time, if with a different perspective, and again, I think it needs to be driven by civil society activism. In other words, it needs to be driven by various democracy groups. It needs to be driven by NGOs, donors, and government itself, encouraging people to think not just about the political party and the personality behind it, but about what's actually going on in that country. Again, it requires access to information. It requires, in the run-up to the democracy, in the run-up to the actual elections, it needs people to be informed about what's actually going on. So if they're not getting informed adequately, they're less likely to make an informed choice. So again, new media can then, in that instance, play quite an effective role in informing people about the issues that are occurring, precisely because if there are more community media, if there's more small commercial media in various areas, they can use new media in order to engage more, in order to interact more. I've heard a few times since I've been here about various examples of small rural communities using mobile phones to check in on local market prices. Now, that sort of thing might seem quite remote from an election period, but it means that when those farmers then go to vote, they know that they'll be able to think back over the year and track what kind of prices they've been fetching from the information that they've been fed over the year. So their vote is likely to be slightly more informed this time than it was the previous time when they didn't have access to that kind of information. So it's on that level. But then again, I go back to the point of media and traditional media need to adopt some kind of a citizen's agenda when they report on elections that takes it away from the political party, away from the personality, and focuses more on the actual issues. They can still focus on the personality, but then they can drive to the issues using that focus on the personality.
We have a final comment queued up from Professor Dugmore.
I think we're going to see an explosion of things we haven't even thought about yet in terms of how cell phones get used to monitor elections, to get the word out, how SMS, how Twitter, and a variety of other things that are accessible on cell phones, how they really transform the election landscape. We already got a hint of that in the Zimbabwean elections, the Ghanaian elections, the Kenyan elections, the South African elections this year. Cell phones are center stage, and they're going to be, I think, the big story about media and democracy over the next 5 years.
Okay, well, with that, Professor Dugmore is going to have the last word. I want to first of all thank our panelists for what I thought was an excellent job. Please join me in thanking them. And certainly, I would like to thank Free Voice for making this all possible. This was, I think, a very interesting and informative and fun exercise. And also, primarily, I want to thank all of you who joined us here in this audience and those of you who joined us from literally around the world. This was, I think, a very important step toward all of our goals of creating a more open, free, and pluralistic society and democracy. Thank you so very much for joining us.